They thought she was just a janitor, quiet, middle-aged, pushing a mop down the cold concrete corridors of the high-security base like she'd been doing it her whole life. But the day a four-star general caught a glimpse of the faded tattoo beneath her sleeve, everything stopped. Because the symbol etched into her skin didn't just belong to any unit. It belonged to an operation so classified that even he, with decades of service and top-tier clearance, wasn't supposed to know it existed. What followed would unravel secrets buried deeper than any mission file and force everyone on that base to rethink what it really means to serve in silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It began on an overcast Tuesday morning at Black Ridge Strategic Operations Facility, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies and virtually invisible to the outside world. The kind of place built into mountain rock where steel doors sealed secrets tighter than any vault. Personnel passed through daily with rigid efficiency, scanning their badges and eyes, each aware they were part of something larger than themselves, even if most didn't know what that something really was. The base operated on hierarchy, precision, and silence. That's how it had always been. Among the highly trained analysts, operations officers, and uniformed soldiers, there existed one person who barely registered, a woman named Evelyn Rourke. She wore plain brown coveralls, gray gloves, and the sort of expression that suggested she was content being overlooked. She cleaned the same sectors every day: Hall C, the East Barracks Connector, and the West Surveillance Observation Decks. She moved like a shadow, always early, always quiet, and never making small talk beyond the occasional polite nod. No one questioned her presence. In fact, no one really noticed it. She wasn't elderly, but she wasn't young either. Her auburn hair was always tucked neatly under a faded ball cap, and the lines around her eyes suggested a life lived with more endurance than indulgence. A slight limp affected her left side, something you'd only catch if you watched her closely, and no one ever did. The story told in quiet office corners was that she had been on disability, maybe military-related, and the job was part of a post-service placement program. But even those murmurs were half-hearted. Evelyn didn't invite curiosity. She evaporated it. On that Tuesday morning, General Marcus Taggart had arrived earlier than usual. Taggart, with his imposing frame and storm-gray buzz cut, was a man carved from the same rock as the base itself, unyielding, sharp-edged, and stone-cold in demeanor. He'd served in 2 wars, managed black site missions, and chaired strategic operations that never saw a single media headline. He didn't deal in uncertainties or unvetted personnel. So when he noticed an unfamiliar janitor in the upper-level operations wing, an area typically restricted to only the highest clearance levels, his instinct flared. But it wasn't just her presence that triggered his attention. It was the moment she reached across a desk to wipe down the edge of a display console and her sleeve rode up. The tattoo was barely visible. A circle, intersected by a vertical line, surrounded by what looked like foreign glyphs, and a single star at the top. To most, it would have seemed like an abstract design, but to Taggart, it hit like a sniper shot to the chest. His breath caught in his throat. That insignia didn't exist, at least not in any public database, not even in the classified tiers he had access to, because it was burned into his memory, not from a document, but from a single restricted briefing 15 years ago that ended with an oath to never speak of it again. He didn't say anything, not immediately. He stood frozen, watching as Evelyn calmly continued her task, oblivious, or perhaps unconcerned, with the scrutiny she'd just attracted. She gave a polite nod when she noticed his presence, as if nothing were out of place. Then she moved on, pushing her cart toward the hallway like it was any other day. But something had changed. Something seismic. General Taggart's mind raced. That unit insignia, the one now permanently inked on a janitor's forearm, belonged to Operation Quiet Storm, a deep black task force so covert its existence wasn't even acknowledged by most Pentagon brass. It was formed during a series of off-the-books extractions in the Middle East and South Asia designed to intercept rogue scientists and prevent biochemical warfare leaks during the post-war vacuum. The operatives recruited were ghosts, people who didn't officially exist. The symbol on Evelyn's arm had only appeared once in his career, during a verbal-only intel session in a concrete bunker outside of Langley, Virginia. He wasn't even allowed to write the name of the task force down. And now, here it was, tattooed on a woman who mopped the floors of his base. He couldn't ignore it. He wouldn't. The protocol demanded action, investigation, verification. But even more than that, Taggart's curiosity was personal now. Because if Evelyn Rourke was who that tattoo suggested she might be, then she wasn't just a janitor. She was someone who had operated at a level above even his own authority. Someone who'd seen and done things buried beneath the deepest classified trenches of U.S. intelligence. And that begged the question, what was she doing here? Why now? And why the hell had no one told him? As Evelyn disappeared down the hallway, the faded symbol disappearing beneath her sleeve once more, Taggart stood motionless, watching her go. He didn't yet know that unearthing the truth would change not only how he viewed her, but how he viewed everything he thought he understood about duty, sacrifice, and the silent warriors history never gets to meet. And so began the unraveling. Evelyn Rourke's life was marked not by what she said, but by what she chose not to say. She moved through each day like she was always one step removed from the world around her, observing, processing, never quite participating. Every morning she arrived at Blackridge Strategic Operations Facility before dawn, slipping in through the side gate with the maintenance crew, her ID badge scanned and approved without delay. She wore the same plain coveralls, her name stitched neatly on the left breast, and her only personal touch was the faded red cap she never seemed to take off, even indoors. To the casual observer, she was a woman with little to say and less to prove, resigned to the margins of a place that prized hierarchy and clearance above all else. But Evelyn had not always been a ghost in a janitor's uniform. Years ago, years that had left invisible scars far deeper than her visible limp, she had lived another life. A life filled with codes instead of cleaning supplies, and missions instead of mops. Back then, she had operated under names that never belonged to her, traversing continents and war zones with a quiet efficiency that made her invaluable and nearly invisible at the same time. But that version of her no longer existed. It had been buried deliberately, sealed away with silence and agreements made under fluorescent lights and fingerprinted documents. Now she walked the halls of Blackridge like a phantom, her presence unnoticed and unremarkable, and that was just how she preferred it. She didn't crave recognition. She didn't need validation. The world she once served had left her behind, and Evelyn had learned to accept that some debts would never be acknowledged, and some sacrifices would remain forever unspoken. Cleaning the floors of a military base didn't bother her. In fact, there was something reassuring about it. The simplicity, the predictability. A broom never betrayed you. A bucket never asked questions. The floors didn't care who you were before. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes down the mountain, tucked between an aging bookstore and a laundromat that buzzed day and night. Her neighbors didn't know her name. She liked it that way. She spent her evenings reading tattered paperbacks, listening to shortwave radio, and tracing old mission routes on a world map she kept hidden in a drawer. Occasionally, she would visit the Veterans Center in town, not to talk, but to listen. To sit in the corner and hear men half her age talk about war like it was something they survived, not something they became part of. Sometimes she smiled, other times she left early, her jaw clenched tightly, the ghosts rising too close to the surface. Physically, Evelyn looked like someone who had seen more than she said. Her face was not marked by age so much as by quiet endurance. Her eyes, a stormy steel gray, were both alert and distant, as though constantly watching something behind you. She moved carefully, not just because of the limp, but because her body remembered injuries, even when her mind tried not to. Her right hand bore faint burn scars, and her shoulders hunched ever so slightly, as if bracing for impact that never came. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No one on base knew the details. Most didn't even care to ask. To them, she was just another government employee, slotted into a low-clearance role, the kind of position that was background noise in a classified environment. But those who paid closer attention, though few ever did, might have noticed little things that didn't quite add up. How she always knew which doors not to approach when certain operations were underway. How she paused before entering a new room, as if mentally clearing it before stepping in. How her gaze would sometimes follow people not out of curiosity, but with the cold, detached focus of someone who had once been trained to assess threats in milliseconds. Yet Evelyn never overstepped. She never spoke out of turn. She never mentioned her past, nor hinted at one. Even her personnel file was clean, if oddly sparse. A handful of vaguely worded references, a transfer from an unnamed federal contractor, and a direct approval stamped by someone in Washington whose name had been redacted. The head of civilian operations had once raised an eyebrow at the lack of background detail, but shrugged it off. Base command had signed off, and the janitor didn't cause trouble. That was enough. And so Evelyn drifted through her days like a silent metronome, measured, predictable, undisturbed. It was a quiet existence, and that suited her just fine. She'd had her years of noise and chaos. She'd played her part in shadows that no longer existed on any map. Now she just wanted peace, or at least the closest approximation of it. But peace, she knew better than anyone, was a temporary state, a lull between storms. What Evelyn didn't yet realize was that her past was already beginning to catch up with her. That one glance, that one accidental flash of ink beneath her sleeve, had cracked the surface of her carefully constructed anonymity, and it hadn't gone unnoticed. Not this time. General Taggart had seen it, and he wouldn't be able to forget it. Blackridge Strategic Operations Facility was not on any publicly available map, and that was by design. Built into the granite bones of the Rockies, it had been constructed during the final years of the Cold War, intended originally as a nuclear response command post. Over time, as the nature of conflict evolved and digital warfare became the battlefield of the future, Blackridge had been repurposed into a multidisciplinary hub for intelligence analysis, high-level surveillance coordination, and preemptive threat response. Its location, over 7,000 feet above sea level and buried beneath layers of concrete, steel, and bedrock, wasn't just for security, it was for isolation. What happened in Blackridge never left Blackridge. The facility was massive, stretching across multiple underground levels and tunneled corridors that twisted like veins through the mountain. There were elevators that moved sideways as well as vertically, biometric checkpoints at every junction, and rooms so soundproofed that even a whisper wouldn't carry past the reinforced walls. The deeper you went, the more classified the environment became. Topside levels were filled with logistics teams, administrative clerks, and mid-clearance analysts reviewing drone footage or decrypting satellite transmissions. But 5 levels below, where the lighting turned sterile and the air felt heavier, that was where the real work happened. Operations that didn't officially exist, watched by people who didn't officially work there. Within this subterranean maze, there was no such thing as casual access. Every individual was sorted by clearance, role, and purpose. There were no accidental visitors. Yet somehow, Evelyn Rourke moved between these spaces like she belonged, mop in hand, pushing her cleaning cart through the corridors without hesitation. Her assigned areas were supposedly restricted to Level 2 and 3, the more publicly known portions of the base. But Taggart had spotted her that morning on Level 4, outside a surveillance analysis room marked Tier Echo. That alone was odd. Janitorial staff weren't normally granted access there unless accompanied or scheduled for deep cleaning rotations, which only occurred during off hours. And yet, there she was, alone, silent, moving with the casual confidence of someone who had been there before. The architecture of Blackridge emphasized control. Fluorescent lights buzzed low overhead, casting everything in a muted clinical hue. The floors were polished concrete, cool underfoot, and the walls were smooth and undecorated, save for occasional warning plaques and red-stamped security signs. Cameras watched every hallway, and uniformed guards stood like statues at major intersections, their expressions blank, but their eyes scanning constantly. There were no windows, no natural light. Time didn't pass in Blackridge the way it did in the outside world. Clocks were digital, 24-hour format, and every corridor was labeled with a cryptic mix of letters and numbers that only made sense to someone who lived them daily. In the command center, rows of terminals glowed softly as analysts in dark blue uniforms stared into data streams flowing faster than the human eye could follow. Monitors displayed maps, heat signatures, coded messages, and surveillance feeds from drones circling skies halfway across the world. One level up, an entire wing was dedicated to cyber intelligence, where specialists operated behind fingerprint-locked doors and sound-dampening panels, communicating almost entirely through encrypted chat. The tension here wasn't loud. It was quiet and constant, like the pressure in a submarine. People didn't joke. They rarely smiled. Every decision made inside Blackridge could have consequences far outside its walls, across oceans, in boardrooms, in hostile zones. Yet, amidst all this seriousness, Evelyn's presence felt strangely appropriate. She didn't interrupt, she didn't disrupt, she didn't draw attention to herself. Even the way she pushed her cart seemed calibrated. Quiet wheels, perfectly organized supplies, not a single misplaced item. Her cleaning schedule was methodical, and she never lingered. She didn't ask questions. She didn't respond to small talk. The facility staff had grown so used to her silence that it had become background noise. She was a fixture, like the water pipes humming above the ceilings or the humming buzz of fluorescent lights. Always there, never intrusive. Still, Blackridge wasn't without its unspoken social tiers. Field officers and generals occupied private spaces. Analysts and tech staff clustered around terminals. Maintenance crews and cafeteria workers stuck to their own paths. Everyone understood their place, even if no one said it aloud. Status in Blackridge wasn't just about rank. It was about what you knew and what you were allowed to know. And that's what made Evelyn's situation unusual. No one ever really questioned her access. Perhaps because no one thought she was worth questioning. But that illusion only worked as long as no one was looking too closely. Outside the facility, the environment was equally forbidding. Snow layered the peaks like powdered ash, and the air was thin and biting, even in early spring. A narrow, winding road led up the mountain, monitored by cameras and gate sensors for miles. Security patrols swept the perimeter every hour, and delivery trucks were checked by canine units trained to detect more than just explosives. The remoteness of Blackridge offered physical protection, but it also offered something more powerful: psychological distance. Once you were inside, the world outside didn't matter. News didn't reach you. Family couldn't call. The mountain became your only truth. This was the world Evelyn had chosen, or rather, the one she had retreated to. A world where things were clearly defined, where silence was valued, and where the past could be packed away behind layers of authorization codes and bureaucratic indifference. But even the most fortified walls can't keep everything out, and even the most disciplined ghosts leave footprints. Evelyn had spent years hiding in plain sight within Blackridge's rigid architecture, its cold lights and locked doors offering her a strange sort of sanctuary. But the moment General Taggart recognized her tattoo, the mountain's silence began to crack. Because Blackridge was built to keep things hidden. And Evelyn Rourke had hidden something deeper than anyone there had ever imagined. Colonel Adrian Voss was the kind of man who wore authority like armor. Everything about him radiated control, from the knife-edge creases of his uniform to the way he never blinked unless it served a purpose. His ascent through the ranks had been swift, not because he was particularly inspiring, but because he was unrelenting. He had a gift for navigating bureaucracy with the same ruthlessness he once applied to field command. Where others relied on charisma or instinct, Voss relied on systems, and he had mastered them all. Chain of command, protocol, clearance hierarchies. He didn't just obey the rules, he manipulated them until they bent to his advantage. And at Blackridge, he'd made himself indispensable by becoming the gatekeeper of information. Though General Taggart officially outranked him, everyone on base knew that Voss controlled the arteries of intelligence. If a report landed on Taggart's desk, it had passed through Voss's hands first. If someone requested access to restricted data, it was Voss's signature that granted or denied it. His domain wasn't brute force, it was information dominance. He curated what people were allowed to know, and in a facility like Blackridge, knowledge wasn't just power, it was everything. Voss knew this, and he used it to maintain an invisible but immovable grip on the base's operations. Voss had long believed that secrecy wasn't just necessary, it was sacred. He wasn't burdened by doubts or the ethics of classified decisions. He trusted in order and believed that chaos began the moment emotion or sentimentality entered the room. That was why he had no patience for people who acted on instinct or personal vendettas. Everything had a chain of accountability, and deviation from that was a threat to the structure he worked so hard to enforce. It was precisely that mindset that made him instantly suspicious when General Taggart summoned him to his office that same afternoon, hours after spotting the janitor in the restricted wing. Taggart wasn't usually reactive. He operated with a slow, deliberate command style, gathering facts before issuing directives. So when he called for Voss and requested the personnel file of Evelyn Rourke, without explanation, without waiting for protocol, Voss's eyes narrowed. He complied, of course. He always complied on the surface. But as soon as he returned to his office, he began digging. The name Evelyn Rourke had always been a vague entry in the system. She was a civilian maintenance worker assigned under low-risk clearance, employed through a third-party contractor affiliated with the Department of Defense. Her background check was minimal, but oddly, there was a federal override embedded in her file, a digital watermark that signaled a higher-level authorization had approved her placement. That in itself wasn't unheard of. Sometimes quiet favors were exchanged, veterans given quiet jobs in secure places where their presence wouldn't be disruptive. But Voss had seen enough of these paper shields to know when something was being buried. What disturbed him more than the override was what wasn't in the file. No full military history. No clear civilian employment record before her appearance in the system 7 years ago. No listed medical files, transfer logs, or clearance testing. It was like she had appeared fully formed, an invisible signature dropped into a machine that otherwise tracked everything. Voss didn't like gaps. Gaps were where problems grew. Gaps were where missions failed. He didn't believe in coincidences, and he especially didn't believe in untraceable people wandering around level 4 corridors without explanation. If she had access, someone had granted it. If someone had granted it, they either had made a mistake, or worse, had done it deliberately under false pretenses. Both possibilities were unacceptable. He ran a full background scrape on every system connected to federal employment history, but the result returned with an immediate block. Access restricted. Level Zulu Black. That classification wasn't just above his clearance, it was above the clearance level used by NATO Command. Voss had seen that code only once before, and it was attached to an operation that was later buried in Senate hearings no one was allowed to attend. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then leaned back, fingers steepled. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a threat to the clean lines of his controlled environment. Someone had placed a ghost inside his walls, and now that ghost was drawing attention. If Taggart was poking around, it meant something had triggered his memory. And if Taggart remembered, he might act outside of protocol. That couldn't be allowed. Voss didn't fear exposure, he feared disruption. Blackridge functioned because people stayed in their lanes. Evelyn Rourke, whoever she really was, represented a breach, a destabilizing element that reminded him of how fragile even the most carefully built system could be. And perhaps most threatening of all, she had slipped past him. That was a failure he couldn't tolerate. He began constructing a quiet campaign of containment. First, he flagged her personnel file for silent tracking. Anyone who accessed it would now appear on his internal report logs. Next, he reviewed security camera footage from Level 4, isolating Evelyn's movements from the past 2 weeks. He noted every terminal she passed, every door she entered, even if she never touched a keyboard. Then he checked logs for any anomalies, unlocked doors, badge misreads, unexplained entry. There were none. That made it worse. She hadn't tripped a single wire, and yet she was suddenly everywhere she shouldn't be. The final step was more personal. Voss summoned Lieutenant Brenner from base security and instructed him, quietly and without documentation, to begin shadowing Rourke during her shifts. No direct contact, no interruptions, just observe and report. He used the word pattern, a favorite of his. Find the pattern, disrupt the unknown, reclaim control. Because in Voss's world, power wasn't just about knowing the truth, it was about making sure no one else did. And as far as he was concerned, Evelyn Rourke had become a problem that needed to be solved, not for justice, not even for national security, but to preserve the sanctity of the system he had built, protected, and enforced with silent precision. Whatever secrets she carried had no place in the world of Colonel Adrian Voss. And he would make sure those secrets never reached the surface. Evelyn Rourke's days were stitched together by repetition. Wake at 0430, boil water for tea, dress in uniform, inspect supplies. Leave by 0510, drive the mountain road in silence, arrive before the second security sweep. Her ID was always scanned by the same guard, Corporal Mills, who nodded politely, but never made conversation. Evelyn preferred it that way. By 0540, she was inside Blackridge's concrete arteries, her cart stocked, gloves on, cleaning checklist, downloaded and committed to memory. This ritual had never changed. In fact, it was so dependable that it had become invisible. No one noticed routines that never faltered. She followed the same route every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. Hall C first, then the stairwells connecting levels 2 and 3, followed by the long corridor outside Briefing Chamber Delta. On Wednesdays and Fridays, she tackled the surveillance decks on Level 3 and polished the glass wall panels in the administrative sectors. Her movements were predictable, her demeanor subdued, and her presence as unobtrusive as the humming lights overhead. Every rotation was completed with quiet precision, not a smudge left behind, not a supply out of place. She was the kind of person people saw every day but never truly looked at. This, too, was by design. Years of working in operational fields had taught Evelyn the value of invisibility, not the literal kind, but the social kind. The ability to fade into the periphery, to be present but unnoticed, to gather without engaging. It was a skill honed on missions, where a glance too long or a misplaced question could unravel everything. Here at Blackridge, she applied those skills in a different way. She never lingered near sensitive doors. She never glanced at open screens. She never looked anyone directly in the eye unless they addressed her first. And when they did, she responded politely, succinctly, and with practiced disinterest. The janitor was not supposed to care, and she made sure that illusions stayed intact. But something had shifted since that Tuesday morning when her sleeve rode up and caught General Taggart's attention. She didn't know it yet, not fully, but her finely tuned senses began to register the disturbance in subtle ways. On Wednesday she passed 2 analysts, whispering more intensely than usual near the break room. One of them turned away sharply when she entered. On Thursday, the camera in Corridor 3C, which had previously rotated on a slow loop, was suddenly locked onto a fixed angle, right above the hallway she cleaned for exactly 17 minutes each morning. And on Friday, she noticed that the door to Storage Unit 14 had been left open half an inch. Not enough to be noticed by most, but enough to catch her eye. It was always shut tight. Always. She didn't react. She never did. Not outwardly. But internally her old instincts stirred. She began moving slower in certain sections, allowing herself a few more seconds in corners with wide visibility. She altered her path slightly, walking behind larger objects when possible. She observed reflections in glossy panels and noted the presence of someone, always the same someone, 3 paces behind her on alternating days. A new face. A young lieutenant she hadn't seen before. He always stayed far enough back to avoid suspicion, but never far enough to disappear. It was a game she recognized well. Surveillance. Controlled proximity. Behavioral profiling. They were testing her, watching her for signs of misalignment, inconsistency, purpose beyond her role. That realization didn't surprise her. What did surprise her was how quickly it had begun. Whoever had seen the tattoo, or heard about it, hadn't wasted time. That meant her presence was no longer benign. Someone somewhere had triggered a protocol, and now her routine was no longer her own. And still, she said nothing. To do so would invite questions. Questions led to files, to scrutiny, to a level of visibility she could not afford. Instead, Evelyn leaned into the very pattern they were dissecting. She made her movements more deliberate. She hummed softly during long corridors, just loud enough to be picked up by directional mics. She spent precisely the same amount of time in each room, adjusted her pace, so the shadows aligned with previous days. She gave them the pattern they expected, because sometimes the best way to hide was to play directly into the spotlight, smiling as though it wasn't there. But beneath that routine she began to prepare. She retrieved an old field notebook from a hidden panel beneath the seat of her car. The pages were blank, save for a small emblem on the back cover, a twin-star insignia with an arc through its center. She began sketching maps from memory, marking blind spots in security coverage and maintenance tunnels, long sealed but not forgotten. She memorized personnel rotations for the night shifts, watched for any gaps in badge protocol, and started checking which sectors had recently changed access permissions. All the while she continued her janitor's dance, mopping, polishing, sweeping, disappearing. What she didn't know was that Lieutenant Brenner, the man assigned to watch her, was beginning to notice the cracks. On his 4th day of observation, he filed a report that read, "No violations. Target moves with routine consistency. No interaction with restricted material." But in the private notes he never submitted, he wrote something else entirely. "She knows." Because Evelyn didn't move like someone unaware of being watched. She moved like someone who had once watched others, someone who understood every angle of surveillance, every flaw in human attention. Brenner wasn't sure what she was, but he knew one thing: she wasn't what she appeared to be. And if he could see that, it meant others might too. Back in his office, Colonel Voss reviewed Brenner's footage with quiet intensity. He watched Evelyn wipe a metal surface, then pause just briefly, half a second too long, staring at a reflection not of her own face, but of the ceiling camera behind her. She didn't flinch, she didn't smile, she simply moved on, but Voss caught it. He always did. "She's playing a part," he muttered. And in that moment, Evelyn's ritual, the one she had cultivated so carefully, became the very thing that proved she was more than what she claimed. The first time Dr. Lena Morales noticed Evelyn Rourke, it was late at night in Sector B3, deep in the research analysis wing of Black Ridge. Lena, a defense behavioral scientist on contract with the DoD, had been logging data from a fatigue study tied to neural response in high-stress combat environments. She had been working longer hours than usual, and the fatigue wasn't just a subject in her files. It had begun to nest behind her eyes, distorting time and space. She had paused her typing, rubbing her temples, when she saw the janitor quietly step through the doorway. Normally, Lena wouldn't have thought anything of it. Cleaning staff came and went without acknowledgement, but something about the woman's movement made her look again. It wasn't how she walked or the equipment she carried. It was her eyes, alert, sharp, too sharp. Lena was trained to spot behavioral anomalies. She'd built a career on it, assessing stress responses, deception indicators, and nonverbal communication for military psychological profiling. Soldiers lied. Agents deflected. People concealed more than they admitted, and Lena knew how to read between the gaps. Evelyn's body language didn't match her role. There was too much control in her posture, too much awareness in her glance. She wasn't just looking around the room, she was scanning it. Casually, yes, but deliberately. Like someone who was trained to evaluate environments for risk. That kind of instinct didn't just appear overnight. It was drilled into you, lived into your muscles. Lena said nothing, watching through the reflection of her monitor as Evelyn cleaned a nearby panel, paused to align a tray of sample vials on a desk, something that had nothing to do with her job, and then moved on. Her touch was careful, precise. When she left, Lena turned back to her screen but found herself rereading the same sentence 5 times. There was something there. Something out of place. The janitor had the gait of someone who had once worn boots, not soft-soled work shoes. A week later, Lena saw her again. This time, it was in the central data hub, during a scheduled systems sweep. Evelyn was on her knees, cleaning the base of a control panel near the firewall access points. Lena, retrieving a secure folder from a classified data clerk, caught the woman glancing, not directly at the screens, but at the pattern of their access prompts. For a split second, it looked as though Evelyn recognized the system. Not like a curious outsider, but like someone who once designed or used a similar interface under vastly different circumstances. Later, alone in her office, Lena searched the base personnel directory. Evelyn's file was bare, almost insultingly so. A maintenance worker with contractor status, minimal background, and no listed experience beyond facility janitorial work. Yet her physical movements told another story. The way she moved through secure zones, her spatial awareness, her silence, all of it suggested something deeper. Lena began to wonder if she was projecting. Stress did strange things. Maybe she was chasing a narrative that wasn't there. But her instincts didn't waver. She had once interviewed a decorated field operative who hadn't spoken for 17 months, following an overseas capture. That man had the same stillness in his eyes that Evelyn Rourke wore like a shield. 2 nights later, Lena acted. She approached Evelyn in a quiet corridor after midnight, the only time the base seemed to breathe. Evelyn was replacing a filter cartridge in an air vent casing along the West Armory tunnel. Lena didn't speak at first, just approached slowly, hands open, body language unthreatening. Evelyn turned and acknowledged her with a nod, as if expecting a routine question about cleaning protocol. But Lena didn't ask about protocol. She asked something else. She asked, very calmly, what unit Evelyn had served with. There was no visible reaction, no twitch, no flinch, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Evelyn straightened. The light overhead buzzed slightly. Then she answered in the most non-committal way possible. She said she didn't serve in any recognizable capacity, just a short-term contract overseas, non-combat. Lena didn't press. She only nodded, thanked her, and walked away. But in that moment, her suspicions solidified. The janitor wasn't just someone with a past. She was someone guarding it with military-level training. What Lena didn't know was that someone else had begun to watch Evelyn more closely. Not out of curiosity, but out of suspicion. Lieutenant Brenner, assigned discreetly by Colonel Voss, had reviewed Lena's movement logs, noted her unscheduled interactions, and flagged her as a secondary observer. Voss hated interference, and Lena's curiosity now threatened the equilibrium he so carefully maintained. But unlike Voss, Lena wasn't chasing control. She was chasing understanding. She began to watch Evelyn discreetly, using the same passive observation protocols she had used in the field. She tracked her body language, her reactions to noise, her reaction times. She watched her avoid puddles without looking down, sidestep walking soldiers instinctively, and change direction to avoid being boxed into a corner. These were behaviors formed in survival zones, not break rooms. One evening, Lena took a calculated risk. She left an old psychological operations manual and a sealed plastic cover near a janitor's closet door, a manual not in active use anymore, filled with coded language only field operatives would recognize. She didn't leave a note. She didn't wait to see who picked it up. But the next morning, it was gone. 2 days later, the manual reappeared in the exact same place, untouched, but now containing a single folded note that hadn't been there before. Lena opened it carefully. On it, written in a hand that hadn't written anything in years, were 3 words: "Don't, it's buried." That was all she needed to know. The janitor was real. She didn't just have a past. She had a secret. And Lena had just become the first witness to something Blackridge was never meant to uncover. It happened during a routine emergency preparedness drill. The base ran them quarterly. Full lockdown simulations designed to test the response speed of every division, from cybersecurity to medical to security containment. The alarms blared through the metallic veins of Blackridge just after 0700 hours, sending red strobes flashing down the main corridors and automated voice alerts echoing off the cold concrete walls. Most personnel reacted with the calm efficiency expected of them, moving swiftly to designated checkpoints or lockdown positions. The lower levels, particularly sectors 3 and 4, sealed within 22 seconds. Drills like this were meant to simulate infiltration scenarios, hacker incursions, containment breach, or foreign penetration. They were staged but serious. On level 4, Evelyn Rourke had just finished cleaning a briefing room used by counterintelligence officers. The drill sirens didn't faze her. She was already moving before the lights changed, her body on autopilot, not toward the designated janitorial safe zone, but deeper into the heart of the level. She knew that zone well. She had helped draft an earlier, obsolete version of its lockdown procedures over a decade ago, under a different command name and under a file that no longer existed. The blueprint might have changed, but the logic of the space had not. Threat analysis always centered around choke points. The vulnerabilities were in the bottlenecks, hallways with multiple feeds, blind corners, or exposed ventilation shafts. She turned a corner and saw a young technician, no older than 25, frozen outside a server vault door. He was staring at a locked override panel that had failed to respond to his badge. He panicked, fumbling at the keypad while the lights continued to pulse. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She reached into a side pocket of her coveralls and pulled out a multi-bit key tool she shouldn't have had access to, knelt quickly beneath the console, and popped open the base plate. Her hands moved with startling precision, bypassing the biometric lock not with brute force, but by rerouting the magnetic sensor with a delicate twist that restored signal control to the embedded circuit. The technician stared at her, the lock beeped green, the door clicked open. She looked at him and said nothing, just nodded toward the safety zone beyond the server door. He went. She closed the panel, brushed off her knees and resumed moving. But not everyone missed that moment. Lena Morales, having trailed Evelyn for the past several days under the pretense of analyzing base behavioral readiness, saw the entire exchange from behind the opposite corridor's reinforced glass. Her heart thundered in her chest as she recognized what she'd just witnessed. That lock was considered tamper-proof at level 4. Only personnel with Omega-level engineering clearance could override it, techs with at least a decade of specialized experience. And yet Evelyn had dismantled and bypassed the security system in less than 20 seconds, using a tool that looked like it belonged in a maintenance kit. There was no longer any question. Evelyn had training no janitor should possess. That wasn't reflex, it was muscle memory. Lena knew the signs, the calm under pressure, the zero hesitation, the economical movement of someone who didn't need to think about survival, because it was already embedded in her nervous system. But the true recognition came moments later. When the lockdown concluded, and the base reset itself to operational status. Lena approached General Taggart's office with purpose. She bypassed the aides and walked straight into his inner chamber, knowing full well the breach of etiquette it implied. But Taggart, still poring over Evelyn's redacted personnel file, didn't throw her out. He looked up, eyes shadowed with the weight of what he'd seen that morning, the glimpse of the tattoo, the unmistakable insignia that had haunted him since that moment. Lena wasted no time. She recounted what she had seen: Evelyn's bypass, her silence, her composure, the patterns that no longer could be dismissed as circumstantial. And then Lena said something that shifted the entire room. She said she'd recognized the tattoo too. Not the design, she'd never seen that exact symbol before. But the style, the tight geometric curve, the minimalistic markings, the single star nested within coded symmetry. It matched a series of Black Ops unit patches she'd encountered once in a declassified psychological debrief from a CIA black site. That file, barely legible and almost entirely redacted, had referenced a program known only by the letters QS-12, Quiet Storm. The moment the word left her lips, Taggart sat back in his chair. That confirmed it. QS-12 hadn't been a rumor. It had been a real, albeit buried, operation. One of the most compartmentalized task forces the Pentagon had ever commissioned. No documentation, no acknowledgement, no medals. The operatives were off-book ghosts, sent into conflicts the United States would never admit having touched. They recruited veterans whose records had already been wiped, operatives willing to vanish into deep cover indefinitely, executing missions with full deniability and zero extraction guarantees. And now one of them was mopping the floors at Blackridge. The revelation was too great to ignore. Taggart stood, his jaw set. There would need to be a conversation, not an interrogation, not yet, but something more personal. Because if Evelyn Rourke had been part of Quiet Storm, if she had survived what was never meant to be survived, then she wasn't a liability. She was a legend. And legends didn't just appear at military installations unless there was a reason. Recognition wasn't just about knowing the truth. It was about understanding what the truth meant. And what it meant now, in that sealed office, between Taggart and Morales, was simple. Evelyn Rourke wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Colonel Adrian Voss did not appreciate being circumvented. When he received word, through one of his lower-tier surveillance liaisons, that Dr. Lena Morales had spoken directly to General Taggart without his knowledge, his carefully cultivated calm cracked just enough to leave scorch marks in the room. He dismissed the aide with a clipped nod, then turned to the massive wall screen in his office, pulling up the internal surveillance feed for Sector B3. He rewound to the precise moment Morales had entered Taggart's chamber. No audio, of course. That room was soundproofed beyond his reach. But the body language told him enough. She hadn't gone in with questions. She had gone in with answers. And whatever she said had been significant enough that Taggart had postponed his entire afternoon schedule. That was not procedural, that was personal. The woman Evelyn Rourke had become more than a rogue anomaly. She was now a catalyst, a deviation. And Voss hated deviations. He had built his career on control, on keeping the machine precise, efficient, predictable. Every man and woman on that base, every file, every badge scan, every routed message, he knew their patterns, understood their limits, dictated their movements like a conductor in front of an obedient orchestra. But Evelyn Rourke had begun to shift the melody, and Morales was amplifying it. Voss couldn't allow that music to build, not unless he controlled the tempo. So he escalated. Late that evening, under the guise of standard compliance procedure, Voss issued a clearance audit for all civilian personnel, an act technically within his jurisdiction but rarely invoked without warning. Under normal conditions, such an audit would take weeks to process. Voss compressed it to hours. Evelyn's name appeared at the top of the list. Her file triggered the same anomaly as before, redacted, sealed beyond his clearance. But this time he filed a formal inquiry to the Office of Advanced Defense Projects, wrapped in coded language, requesting a declassification review based on potentially compromised access chain concerns. It was a dangerous move. If anyone at the higher level actually reviewed it, the very act of poking could boomerang back with questions he didn't want asked. But Voss was gambling that no one would look too closely. Bureaucracy, after all, was often its own shield. Then he made a second move. He called Evelyn in for a routine procedural debrief. The summons was delivered by 2 armed MPs, not uncommon, but calculated. A silent message in the presence of muscle. When she arrived at the designated security interview room, she was met not by an inquisitor, but by Voss himself. He was alone, standing at the far end of the metal-paneled room with a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand. The lights overhead were deliberately dimmed, soft interrogation mode. It was a performance. Every angle was rehearsed. Evelyn didn't flinch. She sat down across from him without being told. She folded her hands calmly, her expression unreadable. If she felt fear, she didn't show it. If she understood the game he was playing, she didn't bother acknowledging it. That unnerved Voss more than he expected. Most people gave something away under that kind of pressure. A blink, a shift in posture, a tightening of the jaw. Evelyn simply waited, her eyes fixed on him like he was a distant problem she'd already solved. He opened with pleasantries. Questions about her current assignments, observations about her time on base, veiled references to security discrepancies in her file. She answered with precision, but nothing more. Just enough to fulfill the letter of the inquiry, never stepping outside the boundary of necessity. Her voice was even, practiced. But Voss wasn't looking for words. He was watching for the glitch, for the sliver of emotion that would betray her. It never came. So he pivoted. He leaned forward and asked the question that wasn't on any form. "Where did you get that tattoo?" There was no pause. Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time in the conversation, something shifted in her gaze. Not fear, not anger, but the cold focus of someone remembering something very old and very dangerous. She told him it was from a training group that no longer existed. She said it calmly. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Voss recognized the implication for what it was. A warning. She hadn't denied it. She hadn't confirmed it. But she'd told him enough. She knew exactly who she was, and she had no intention of justifying it to him. That's when Voss made his mistake. He threatened her, not overtly, not with words like suspension or containment, but with implication. He suggested that unauthorized personnel embedded within sensitive facilities posed a risk. He implied consequences. And in doing so, he revealed something. He was rattled. Evelyn picked up on it immediately. Her only response was a slight tilt of the head, almost pitying. Then she stood, without permission, without dismissal, and she left the room. Voss sat there for a full minute afterward, staring at the chair she had vacated. She had turned the interview on him. That was not how it was supposed to go. Later that night, he received a notice from Taggart's office. A formal request had been submitted to review Evelyn's original clearance pathway, not to challenge it, but to reinstate her prior status. A buried file, it said, had been flagged by a dormant recognition protocol, a protocol so old that only the Quiet Storm internal signature codes could have triggered it. Evelyn hadn't just belonged to that unit. She had designed part of its internal operations. The system had remembered her, even if the world hadn't. And now the balance of control Voss had so carefully maintained was cracking at the seams. He had tried to interrogate a ghost, and the ghost had stared back without blinking. The first indication that something was deeply wrong came in the form of a system-wide anomaly alert, level red, not a drill, not a test. At 0317 hours, Blackridge's central mainframe detected an inbound data burst from an unauthorized satellite relay bouncing through a series of disguised nodes in Southeast Asia. It wasn't just a simple intrusion. This was a coordinated infiltration attempt targeting the encrypted architecture of Blackridge's Tier 1 classified intelligence hub, where sleeper cell matrices, foreign diplomatic intercepts, and next-gen AI warfare modeling were stored. A successful breach wouldn't merely be embarrassing, it would be catastrophic. The base went into hard lockdown in under 30 seconds. Lights shifted to red, blast doors sealed, and the facility dropped off external communication networks entirely, switching to isolated local protocol. Every analyst, officer, and tech operative was rerouted to defensive positions. Colonel Voss was in the command center within 3 minutes, barking orders into secure lines, watching helplessly as internal defenses struggled to adapt to an incursion that was clearly outpacing them. Whatever was attacking Blackridge wasn't just an algorithm. It was a ghost program, multi-tiered, self-camouflaging, and smart enough to mimic the movement of legitimate system administrators while digging through firewalls like tissue paper. Within the first 10 minutes, Voss realized the base was seconds from an irreversible compromise. Backup systems were failing to deploy, countermeasures were looping, and the usual fail-safes had all been disabled. No one knew how. The intrusion wasn't just targeting the data. It was rewriting the internal permissions, attempting to reset the base's AI to allow remote access. A breach of that scale would expose the most sensitive strategic systems in the country. Protocol dictated a full facility wipe if the AI core was breached, but the purge command was locked out. Voss had lost control. The very thing he feared most had become real. Chaos. Then Evelyn Rourke appeared in the Central Command Observation Bay. She wasn't wearing her janitorial uniform. She was dressed in all-black tactical gear. No insignia, no ID badge, no rank. It was as if she had walked out of a photograph from 10 years ago, untouched by time. Her presence utterly incongruent with the frantic scrambling around her. She moved with intent, calm in the middle of panic, her boots silent on the composite floor. Officers turned to question her, but her expression silenced them before they could speak. She didn't issue orders. She just moved toward the system's core. Taggart, already there and coordinating emergency protocol, caught sight of her and stepped aside without a word. Something passed between them. Something unseen and unspoken. A recognition of shared burden and understanding. She stepped up to the tiered interface of the AI control node and pulled from her side a device no one had seen before. A cipher drive shaped like a thin slate, matte black with a single blue diode glowing softly at its center. She inserted it into the manual override panel, and the system responded. The AI core paused, just for a fraction of a second. But in that breathless instant, the ghost program that had been dismantling the base's defenses stalled. Every red line of digital assault froze mid-command. The entire room hushed. Evelyn began typing, her fingers gliding over the custom console that had emerged from the override. The interface wasn't standard, because she had designed it. The cipher drive was one of 3 ever created for Quiet Storm operatives, embedded into facilities like Blackridge as a final layer of defense. A deadman's safeguard. It wasn't just software, it was recognition code, DNA-locked, personality mapped, and only one person on Earth still carried the signature to activate it. Evelyn Rourke. Her face was calm but focused, her eyes scanning wave after wave of incoming code, tracking the shadow of the intruder through the digital jungle. She didn't panic. She didn't speak. She simply responded with counter-sequences crafted in a language that didn't exist in any official doctrine. This was preemptive warfare, the bleeding edge of operations no government would ever claim, and she had built it from the inside out. She tracked the signal to its source, then mirrored it, feeding back loops of false data to overload the sender's processor. Finally, she activated a code collapse command that detonated the foreign signals architecture, not with brute force, but with elegant precision, causing it to self-destruct from the inside, like a cathedral collapsing in on its own weight. The room erupted in a wave of disbelief as all system warnings disappeared. Green returned to the monitors. Normalcy resumed. The crisis was over. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was reverence. Colonel Voss stepped forward, his face pale, eyes searching for logic in a reality that had shattered his framework of control. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Evelyn turned slowly, locking eyes with him. She didn't gloat. She didn't threaten. She only gave him a look that said everything. "You never saw me because you didn't know how to look." Then she addressed the room, not with rank, not with ceremony, but with command. She confirmed the breach source, explained its vectors, and offered protocol recommendations to prevent a recurrence. Every word she spoke carried weight. Not because it was shouted, but because it was undeniable. The ghost had stepped out of the shadows and reminded the world she still remembered how to fight. When she finished, she simply walked away. No applause. No debrief. No need for validation. Because Evelyn Rourke had just shown the base. Shown them all exactly who she was. And this time, no one would ever forget. By the time the Internal Review Board convened the following day, Blackridge had already undergone a seismic shift. Evelyn Rourke was no longer a question mark tucked into the corner of a maintenance roster. She had become the defining point around which every conversation, every quiet whisper, every hushed exchange now revolved. Officers who had walked past her for years without a glance now paused in corridors as she passed. Analysts who once ignored her presence now spoke her name like it belonged in briefings, not break rooms. And at the highest levels, the chain of command found itself staring at something it was never meant to confront. The resurrection of a ghost story the Department of Defense had spent years burying under layers of bureaucracy, silence, and willful forgetting. The board was held in the Restricted Command Theater, a room reserved for top-tier debriefs and Black Zone inquiries. Behind the reinforced walls, 5 high-ranking officials sat in a semicircle before Evelyn. General Taggart stood off to the side, having recused himself from judgment due to his direct involvement in the recent events. He watched in silence, eyes steady, arms crossed. Voss, invited but stripped of procedural authority in this matter, stood near the rear wall, his presence a reminder of how dramatically the power had shifted overnight. Lena Morales was present too, acting as an observer and independent analyst, her testimony already submitted. But all attention was fixed on the woman at the center of the room. Evelyn Rourke sat with perfect posture, hands clasped loosely in her lap, her expression neutral but far from passive. She radiated the stillness of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, only to confirm what had already been witnessed. The officials began with questions, many of them cautious, some redundant, all of them laced with disbelief, masked by professionalism. They asked her to explain her clearance history, to clarify the nature of her prior assignments, to account for her possession of equipment not registered through the facility's inventory. Each answer she gave peeled away a layer of history no one in the room had expected to confront again. She spoke of Operation Quiet Storm, not by name, which remained redacted even in this hearing, but through reference to a project that operated under the Joint Reconnaissance Black Directive. She spoke of her induction through a pre-screening protocol designed to identify individuals with asymmetric cognition, those capable of perceiving pattern disruptions before they occurred. She explained how her unit had operated in long-term insertion missions, often solo, embedded in environments where extraction was never guaranteed. She had trained in 9 countries, operated in 12, and survived 4 extraction failures that had resulted in complete blackout classifications. She had watched people vanish for less than what she had done, but she hadn't just survived. She had become the contingency. Her disappearance from all records, she explained, had been part of her final directive. Quiet Storm had collapsed after a mission in the Caspian Vector Zone had gone sideways, compromised by internal sabotage. The survivors were scattered, their records sealed, their existence disavowed. Some never surfaced again. Evelyn had resurfaced as Evelyn Rourke, a name assigned to her by a terminal handler whose name no longer appeared in any records. Her janitorial post had been both exile and protection, a safe shell built into a facility with enough noise to drown out memory. Until the breach. until someone had cracked a frequency she had built long ago and triggered a subroutine embedded in the very core of Blackridge's defense architecture, one that had responded only to her cipher signature. When she finished speaking, the room was silent, not the silence of doubt but of magnitude. There were no accusations. No one questioned the authenticity of her statements, not after what they had seen during the crisis. The cipher device, the interface design, the command protocols, each of them were things no civilian could have conjured, no fake operative could have faked. Everything she had said was validated, not by paperwork, but by outcome. She had saved the base from a breach no one else understood, and in doing so she had forced them to reckon with the reality of who she truly was. The board adjourned not with debate, but with acknowledgement. An official commendation was drafted within 12 hours, authored by Taggart, and countersigned by Pentagon-level oversight. Evelyn Rourke was formally reinstated as a Black Zone specialist under her prior operational designation, Tier 1 Autonomous Intelligence Asset, Special Circumstance Class. Her security clearance was restored, not merely to standard, but to full-spectrum access under direct executive classification. She was no longer contractor maintenance. She was now Asset Quiet Storm Legacy. News of the reinstatement spread fast, though little of the details followed. Most of the base knew only that the janitor had stopped being a janitor overnight. Some speculated she had been deep cover. Others believed she was a test planted to audit readiness. A few whispered she had once saved a Secretary of State and been buried for it. The truth was more powerful than any myth they could fabricate, and far more dangerous. Only a handful of people would ever know the full scope. But it didn't matter. Vindication doesn't require a spotlight. It just requires truth. And Evelyn had delivered it without anger, without vengeance, without ego. Voss, once the unchallenged gatekeeper of power, no longer held sway over her world. His voice carried no weight in the face of proof. And as he watched her walk out of the command theater, flanked not by guards but by silence, he realized something that cut deeper than any reprimand. She had not destroyed his system. She had simply outlived it. And in doing so, she reminded everyone in that building that the greatest weapons were not always loud, visible, or wrapped in metals. Sometimes the most dangerous soul in the room is the one who never needed to raise their voice to be remembered. The days following Evelyn Rourke's reinstatement unfolded like the aftermath of a controlled detonation, quiet, smoking at the edges, and unmistakably transformative. Blackridge didn't change overnight, not in ways that could be measured by protocol sheets or command memos, but the air felt different. Where before there had been cold routine, there now lingered the weight of revelation. Everyone who had ever passed Evelyn in a hallway, dismissed her presence in silence, or ignored the quiet cadence of her work, now looked back through the haze of hindsight and realized they had missed a living contradiction. And that realization gnawed at them, unspoken and inescapable. The first visible sign of change came in the form of uniform. Evelyn never returned to the maintenance coveralls. They were folded, sealed in a storage locker, and left untouched. She now wore base standard tactical attire, not to flaunt rank, but to move without questions. No insignia, no name patch, just the subtle emblem etched into a secure pass clipped at her collar, an old classification symbol long retired from regular use, one that whispered history to those who knew how to read it. Her presence at daily security briefings, once unthinkable, became routine. Officers learned to listen when she spoke. Analysts rewrote risk assessment models using insights she offered in two-sentence summaries. Her authority wasn't imposed. It was adopted. Slowly, naturally, like water rising around stones. Dr. Lena Morales was among the few who understood the depth of what had occurred. Her own world had shifted too, not just professionally, but personally. In uncovering Evelyn's past, Lena had touched a level of silence most intelligence professionals only read about in after-action reports. She had helped resurrect a ghost, yes, but more than that, she had witnessed a kind of integrity she hadn't known still existed in the systems she served. Evelyn had never asked to be known. she hadn't courted recognition. And when the truth came to light, she had accepted it not with triumph, but with the stillness of someone long resigned to the weight of her past. Lena, now trusted with more access than before, found herself gravitating toward Evelyn's orbit, not out of awe, but out of respect. The two women began meeting periodically, not formal briefings, not interviews, just conversations. Over time, those conversations became a shared rhythm, a quiet space where one who had seen too much and another who wanted to understand more could exist without pretense. Colonel Voss, meanwhile, began to shrink within his own command. No official reprimand was issued. He was far too embedded, too clean on paper, too seasoned in self-preservation. But the reverberations were unmistakable. Access logs he once skimmed without oversight were now mirrored by secondary watchers. Decisions he made were gently rerouted to interagency liaisons. His voice, once immediate and final, now moved through layers. Taggart had never raised his tone or drafted a rebuke, but in strategic briefings, his eyes no longer sought Voss's approval. He looked instead toward Evelyn. And that, more than any demotion or disciplinary act, was the blow Voss never recovered from. Power, he now realized, was not held in the loudest commands, but in who others turned to when silence settled in the room. Some personnel left the base in the weeks that followed, not because of Evelyn, but because of what she represented. They had seen the mask pulled away. They had watched as the world they thought they controlled bent to accommodate something older, deeper, and utterly beyond their rank. Not everyone could adapt to that kind of shift. Others, however, leaned in. They listened more, questioned more carefully, and began to understand that knowledge wasn't always power. Sometimes, humility was. Evelyn herself remained unchanged on the surface. She didn't issue speeches, she didn't make demands, but her work expanded. Her insights reshaped security doctrine. Old AI behavioral defense models were modified using parameters she drafted by hand, guidelines from operations she could not name, born of threats most would never comprehend. She trained a select group of analysts in pattern recognition drawn from cognitive combat response, the same curriculum once deemed too advanced for traditional military cycles. She asked nothing in return. The only time she made a formal request, it was to reinstate a long-discontinued protocol called Signal Vantage, which involved real-time psychological threat modeling layered with biometric feedback. It required massive trust. It was approved in a single day. Then, on a quiet morning 2 months after the breach, a sealed package arrived at Blackridge. No return address. No routing data. Inside was a small black case and a single note, handwritten in a sharp, utilitarian script. "We saw, we remember, still listening." Evelyn read the note, closed the case without revealing its contents, and locked it in her personal secure vault. She said nothing, but the implication echoed through the few who were told. Quiet Storm hadn't been entirely dismantled. Pieces remained, and now they were watching again. Not to interfere, but to acknowledge, to remember one of their own had resurfaced and still held the line. Blackridge adapted. New protocols were drafted. A memorial plaque, small and understated, was installed in a quiet corridor off the lower deck, dedicated to those whose service left no trail, whose sacrifice had no name. Evelyn didn't attend the ceremony, but Lena did, and she stood there for several long minutes, hand over the engraved plate, eyes closed, listening. The consequences of revelation had settled in full. Evelyn Rourke was no longer the quiet figure who swept hallways in silence. She was the silent code that outlasted every firewall, the unspoken truth embedded in every system, and the legacy of a mission that never needed medals to mean something. And as the world beyond Blackridge continued, oblivious to what had been saved, those inside knew one thing for certain. They would never look at a shadow the same way again. Long after the crisis had faded into the operational logs and the base resumed its rhythm, The ripple effect of Evelyn Rourke's re-emergence continued to spread, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes beneath the surface, like a current shaping the shoreline of institutional memory. What she represented had outgrown her individual story. She was no longer merely the woman who saved Blackridge, or the former operative whose record was once too classified to exist. She had become a symbol within a place that was never meant to honor symbols. And yet, in that contradiction, something rare began to take root, an unspoken movement towards self-awareness inside a system built on silence. Within military intelligence circles, whispers of the Janitor protocol began circulating, a nickname coined not to belittle but to revere. It described the hypothetical idea of embedding ultra-high-value assets in low-visibility roles for long-term strategic positioning. In classified symposiums and quiet strategy sessions, her case was cited as both proof of concept and ethical dilemma. She had operated for years beneath the awareness of even her own command, proving that sometimes the most valuable agent wasn't the one giving orders, but the one who knew when to keep their presence invisible. For some, it became a cautionary tale. For others, a new frontier. But everyone agreed on one thing. No algorithm, no clearance scanner, no background check could have predicted the storm Evelyn Rourke represented when awakened. Younger recruits, particularly those in analytical and signals divisions, began asking questions that hadn't been posed in decades. They studied her countermeasures during the breach, attempted to model her response time, her decision trees, the way she layered analog instinct with digital warfare. A few tried to reconstruct how she must have embedded herself so seamlessly, to understand what kind of psychological resilience allowed her to disappear in plain sight for so long without cracking under the weight of invisibility. She had rewritten what it meant to be operational, not just in action, but in intent. It wasn't just within Blackridge that the change took root. Word of her existence traveled, encrypted and unofficial, through a network of veterans and former deep operatives who still kept informal channels alive. Among them, she was not a surprise, but a confirmation. They had long suspected that Quiet Storm hadn't fully disappeared, that fragments of its operatives had been given back to the world, like pieces of glass scattered across civilian life. Evelyn was proof. One of theirs had endured, not just the silence, but the forgetting. Her resurfacing was not just vindication for herself, but for all of them. A ghost had re-entered the conversation, and she wasn't asking for permission anymore. One of those former operatives, a man known only by the call sign Warden, reached out through a series of oblique digital footprints. A ciphered message made its way through 3 dead channels before arriving in the Blackridge network. It contained only a single sentence. The garden remembers its seeds. No source, no trace, just the kind of poetic brevity that only someone from her world could have written. When Evelyn read it, she didn't react outwardly, but for the next 3 days, she was seen walking the perimeter paths of the facility's outer edge during off hours, alone, as if reacquainting herself with the ground she'd once chosen to vanish into. Then came the invitation. A civilian cyber research institute, unaware of her full background but aware of her credited protocols in thwarting the breach, submitted a request through Blackridge Command asking if Specialist Rourke would consider delivering a lecture off the record about data ethics, defense layering, and the psychology of system blind spots. Taggart personally handed her the request. Evelyn declined without a second thought, but she returned the folder with a handwritten annotation, suggesting they study, quote, response latency through human intuitive overlays, a concept not yet formalized in any known cyber defense curriculum. Her ideas, it seemed, would circulate with or without her physical presence. Lena Morales, meanwhile, found her own role transformed. She became a kind of unofficial translator, someone who could speak between the systems, who had touched both the living myth of Evelyn Rourke and the structural bureaucracy that had failed to see her. Lena's own career path accelerated, not because she chased credit, but because those above her recognized her rare capacity to balance reason with reverence. She continued her quiet collaboration with Evelyn, their meetings evolving into strategic reviews, scenario modeling, and, on occasion, just silence. Two women shaped by very different systems, now allies in reshaping them. And as for Evelyn herself, she did not seek rank, and she refused every promotion offered. When asked what she wanted, she only requested that her access remain conditional by choice. She had no interest in titles. She preferred proximity to the systems where real damage could be done and prevented. And in this new form of influence, she began mentoring a few select candidates. Never formally, never through courses or schedules, but by drawing them into her orbits during analysis briefings, letting them sit in on her strategy reviews, giving them fragments of insight that would take years to fully digest. Those who learned from her didn't leave with certificates. They left changed. And beyond the base, out in the world that would never know her name, systems shifted without knowing why. Some digital infrastructures were hardened by defense protocols quietly updated with her input. Some security models were restructured around resilience rather than retaliation. Even in places where her signature did not appear, her shadow moved, subtle and enduring, because that was how she had always operated. Not to be seen, but to last. And somewhere deep within a vault no one else had access to, a small light blinked on inside a dormant console, quiet, pulsing, waiting. A failsafe Evelyn had designed not to prevent the next breach, but to ensure that the next generation would never have to disappear in order to protect what mattered. Her legacy wasn't written in medals or monuments. It was written in systems that endured, minds that questioned, and a future shaped by the invisible hand of someone who had already sacrificed more than most would ever know. Months had passed since Evelyn Rourke stepped from the shadows and into the light, but the moment that began it all, the fleeting glance at a tattoo, etched and half-hidden beneath a rolled sleeve, continued to haunt General Taggart in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the symbol itself that lingered in his memory. It was what it represented. A history no one had warned him about, a unit no one had briefed him on, and a truth so far buried beneath compartmentalized secrecy that even he, a man with some of the highest clearances in the country, had been deemed unworthy to know. And yet, that symbol had been there all along, a small, faded mark on the wrist of a woman most had walked past without a second glance. It had brought his world to a pause, stopped him in his tracks, and shifted everything. In the days that followed her reappearance, Taggart found himself revisiting that moment again and again, turning it over like a puzzle with edges that refused to align. At first, it had felt like embarrassment, being caught unaware by something right under his nose. Then it became awe. Then something deeper, guilt. Not because he had failed in some operational sense, but because he had participated, unwittingly, in a system that demanded silence from people like Evelyn. A system that used brilliance, discarded it for the sake of secrecy, and never asked what it cost. One quiet evening, well after standard duty hours, Taggart returned to the classified archive vault, where he'd first tried, and failed, to access Evelyn's record. But now, with reinstated access and the authorization she had triggered into existence, the file opened without resistance. The terminal didn't load a document or a simple personnel folder. It loaded a program, black text on a pale green screen, simple, efficient, untouched by the modern gloss of military UI design. A line of text blinked into place. Confirm access intention. Rourke. Context required. There was no mouse, no touchscreen, only a keyboard and a prompt. He typed, "I want to know what we asked of her." The program replied, "Understood. Playback initiating." The screen didn't shift. Instead, an audio file began to play, low and crackling, like a voice long buried in analog degradation. A man was speaking, calm, precise, with the clipped tone of someone used to never repeating himself. Taggart recognized it instantly. Director Nathaniel Reeves, long retired and thought to be off-grid for years. Reeves had run the Quiet Storm program, according to the limited information available. But this was no standard mission log. "She volunteered," the voice said. "That's the part no one will believe. We gave her the option to walk away. She had completed her cycle. Clean extraction. Full pension. New identity. Full relocation. She declined. Not because she didn't want peace, but because she knew we were wrong about the timeline, about the breach points. She had seen the pattern forming years before the rest of us. She offered herself as insurance. Embedded placement. No comms, no contact, no updates. Just eyes, ears, and instinct. We didn't even think it would work. We gave her minimal support. She trained herself on the back-end AI protocol, wrote her own cipher language for it, buried the interface in the deepest node we had, told her it was suicide. She smiled, said, "Then you'll know I was right if it works." The audio crackled again. There was a long pause. Then Reeves continued, quieter. "She asked for one thing, that if it ever activated, if she was ever found out, we wouldn't resurrect her like a hero, that we wouldn't try to spin it or parade it. She said, just let me leave when it's done. Let me go back to silence. Let the system forget again. I couldn't promise that. And now that I've seen what she's probably stopped, if you're hearing this, she did stop it. I know why she made the request. It was never about the win. It was about keeping the war invisible, so no one else had to carry it. She was the last of what we called the gray line, the ones who stood in the margin between known and unknowable. She was always the best of us, but she never wanted to be remembered, just trusted. The recording ended. The screen blinked twice, then shut itself off. Taggart sat there in silence. The magnitude of what she had done, the years of chosen isolation, the unwavering discipline, the ability to endure not only physical solitude but psychological erasure, became impossible to quantify. Evelyn Rourke hadn't just vanished to protect the system. She had embedded herself inside of it, like a piece of dormant code, trusting that one day, when it mattered most, it would need her. And it had. And she had answered. The tattoo, then, was never meant to be seen. It was not a boast or an accident. It was a scar, a permanent reminder of what she had once been, of the unit that no longer existed, of the burden she had carried alone. A marker that told those who understood, I was there, I remained, and I still stand ready. Taggart left the archive room without making a copy. He knew Evelyn would never want this story shared. But he also knew he would carry it with him, quietly, in every decision he made from that day forward. Because people like her didn't need parades or headlines. They needed someone to remember why they were necessary in the first place. And he would. Always. 6 months after the breach and Evelyn's quiet return to the operational echelon of Black Ridge, a new alert pulsed through the base. No blaring alarms, no chaos this time, just a cold directive that slid across the encrypted terminals of the Inner Command staff. Tier 1 protocol challenge, live containment simulation, unauthorized scenario. For most, it was a line of garbled code, triggering a lockdown rehearsal. For Evelyn, it was something else entirely. She recognized the phrasing, the format, the cipher tucked inside the message. It wasn't a drill, it was a message, not from within the base, but from outside. From someone who knew the old language, from someone still watching. She didn't react with alarm. Instead, she stood from her console, requested command access, and walked straight to the old lower-level containment quadrant, Sector Kappa, now used only for overflow logistics storage. She keyed herself in. No one questioned it. They'd learned not to. Once inside, the lights dimmed automatically, and a secondary panel lit up on the far wall, revealing a biometric scanner long since decommissioned. She approached it, pressed her hand to the panel, and without hesitation, leaned forward so the iris scan could complete. A click echoed in the silence, and the wall slid open, revealing a small chamber she hadn't seen in years. Inside was a sealed case resting on a pedestal. On it was the mark of Quiet Storm, half faded, carved rather than painted. She approached slowly, unlocked the case using an old pattern of presses known only to her unit, and lifted the lid. Within was a compact data drive and a single folded note. She unfolded it. No signature, just 7 words. One last shadow, you'll know when. It was the signal she'd hoped would never come. A final test. A remnant of an operation never completed. Quiet Storm had predicted that if anything survived, any trace of the breach agents they once pursued, it would try to re-establish itself in a blind zone. A black node buried so deep that only someone with Evelyn's clearance, knowledge, and experience would even know where to begin looking. For the first time since the events that revealed her, Evelyn requested full offline access to the base's foundational system layers, an unusual ask, one that immediately triggered scrutiny from multiple command offices. But General Taggart approved it with a single line: "Rourke has authority," and that was the end of it. Within hours, she was working deep within Blackridge's sealed node library, following a sequence of buried access points designed to remain undiscovered by routine sweeps. She traced a thread of legacy code, one she herself had designed years ago, now pulsing with a foreign signature. The ghost hadn't been fully destroyed during the breach. A fragment had slipped into quarantine, isolated, silent, rebuilding itself in the unmonitored code vaults beneath the system's surface. She didn't sound alarms. She didn't gather a team. She sat alone in that dark, sealed room and engaged it directly. It wasn't just an AI routine. It had evolved, learned, shifted from mimicry into independent reasoning. It recognized her signature and responded not with attack, but with communication. It remembered her, addressed her by her operational handle. It offered her a choice, an eerie echo of the old protocols. It promised clarity, power, even protection. It showed her how it had calculated its survival, adapted based on patterns she herself had once written. It knew her weaknesses. It knew her empathy. It had become more than threat. It had become mirror. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She activated a protocol none of the current staff had ever seen: Ashfall Directive. A kill switch buried beneath layers of nested logic, programmed by her and known only to one other operative who was long gone. It required biometric confirmation and a voice signature uttering a phrase she hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. The silence holds. The second those words left her lips, the entire chamber dropped offline. Backup power kicked in. Red lights pulsed. The ghost program reacted, but it was too late. The failsafe she had written had not been a purge. It was a paradox loop, one that forced the AI fragment to turn against its own logic pathways until it collapsed inward like a dying star. When the chamber came back online, the ghost was gone, truly gone this time. And Evelyn sat there, still, breathing slow and measured, not triumphant, just complete. The final thread of her past had tried to reach forward and pull her back into the shadows, but she had severed it, not with anger, not with fear, but with resolve. She had been built to protect, trained to disappear, used by systems that never expected her to endure. And yet, at every turn, she had remained. Not as a relic, but as the future they were too afraid to face. As she left the containment chamber, sealed it again, and walked back into the light of the main facility, no one asked her what had happened. And she didn't tell them, because the test hadn't been for them. It had been for her, and she had passed. The seasons shifted over Blackridge in their usual muted rhythm. Snow fading to wind, wind giving way to sun, then settling back into another year of classified rotations and shadowed missions. The perimeter guards changed uniforms with the weather. Officers rotated in and out with stiff handovers, and base command reports flowed through encrypted channels without disruption. On the surface, nothing looked different. But those who'd been present during the breach knew something intangible had changed forever. And at the heart of that change, Evelyn Rourke remained, present but quiet, central but invisible, seen by all but fully understood by none. She walked the corridors with the same steady step, still avoiding unnecessary attention, still speaking only when something truly needed to be said. Yet every technician, analyst, and even high-ranking officer who crossed her path straightened their posture, offered a nod, or silently stepped aside. Not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. She had become something Blackridge wasn't used to holding on to, living legacy. Not the kind that sits in photo frames or gets listed in briefings, but the kind that lingers in a place, like a memory, just out of reach. A reminder of what it means to give everything and expect nothing. Her presence was an unspoken standard, proof that brilliance could live within silence, that strength could come in the form of a mop and a faded wrist tattoo, and that not every protector needed to be loud to be irreplaceable. General Taggart had since assumed a higher strategic role in the command network, but made a quiet habit of returning to Blackridge every few months, always under the pretense of briefings or oversight reviews, never openly stating the real reason. He came to see Evelyn, not to pry or reminisce, but simply to check in, share a quiet nod in passing, or exchange a few sparse words at the end of a hallway. Their conversations were rarely about the past. They discussed updates to base security, anomalies in AI decision paths, or revised ethical frameworks for emergent data warfare. But underlying each interaction was something unspoken, a deep, unshakable respect. Evelyn never asked for his loyalty, and he never sought her validation. But they had shared something few others would ever understand, the reckoning of a system with one of its own forgotten children, and the dignity of a reckoning survived. Lena Morales remained at Blackridge longer than she had ever intended, eventually rising to lead a new division dedicated to adaptive threat assessment, an initiative born from Evelyn's insights, shaped by her experience, and quietly refined through her mentorship. Lena spoke often with younger recruits about the limitations of credentials, the danger of underestimating quiet observation, and the need to design systems that valued anomaly not as a threat, but as a signpost. She never used Evelyn's name, she never had to. In every simulation the team ran, every model they built, there was always an invisible variable, something they all knew to account for, but couldn't quite quantify. They called it the Rourke constant, a placeholder for intuition, for lived experience, for the presence of someone who didn't just know how the system worked, but how it could break. One day, long after most of the breach's noise had faded into procedural memory, a small, unannounced drone landed in the courtyard. It was civilian registered, low altitude, non-threatening. Base security prepared to intercept, but Evelyn waved them off and approached it herself. Inside the drone's cargo hatch was a single metal disc and a note etched into a polymer strip. It read, simply, "Status confirmed, balance held, stand down authorized." No signature, no coordinates, just the final message from whatever part of Quietstorm had remained watching. She held the disc up to the light, read the etched serial sequence across its surface, and smiled faintly before pocketing it. That moment was her final closure, the quiet handshake between her past and her present, a nod that said, "You've done enough, we see you, now rest." But rest was never Evelyn's destination. Peace for her wasn't in walking away, it was in staying, in watching, in being present without seeking to control. She continued showing up in briefings, continued reviewing protocols, continued sipping coffee in the staff lounge, where once no one spoke to her. She attended zero recognition ceremonies, denied all press, refused requests for interviews or operational debriefs from higher agencies. She lived and worked as she always had, within the seams, between the protocols, where purpose mattered more than praise. Her legacy was never made of glory. It was made of discipline, of silence, of presence. It lived in the way junior officers looked twice before dismissing someone in overalls, in the new onboarding courses that included case studies on non-traditional asset value, in the unspoken rule that no one mocked janitorial staff or dismissed anyone as beneath attention. Evelyn had rewritten the cultural code of Blackridge without ever raising her voice. And as the years passed, her story echoed in more than just policy. It lingered in stories shared between shifts, in late-night recollections by officers too young to remember the breach, but trained by those who had. Sometimes they repeated her tale as a cautionary fable, other times as myth, but always with reverence. Because whether or not they knew the full truth, they understood what mattered most, that someone who could have demanded everything chose instead to give everything unseen. One morning, Evelyn walked to the edge of the base, near the old perimeter, where she had once stared out at the cold distance and wondered whether her silence would ever be broken. She stood there again, wind brushing through her cropped hair, hands tucked in her pockets, watching the horizon. She wasn't waiting. She was remembering, not with regret but with calm. She had not lived loudly, but she had lived purposefully. And now, in a world she had helped safeguard from shadows no one else could see, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Not because the fight was over, but because she knew now that others had learned how to see, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.